Hello again, my dreaming souls. Tonight, we lift our eyes from the earth and journey into the stars, tracing the story of one of the most dramatic races in human history, the space race. Born from the icy tension of the Cold War, this was no ordinary rivalry. It was a battle not just for technological supremacy, but for the soul of the future. It began with a beep, a tiny Soviet satellite called Sputnik that pierced the sky in 1957 and sent shivers through the Western world. From classrooms to command centers, panic and awe followed in its silent orbit. We'll explore how nations trained their first astronauts, not just in science, but in survival, isolation, and the unknown. And we'll relive that unforgettable moment in 1969, when the world held its breath and listened as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, uttering words that would echo through time. But this story also includes secrets, Soviet failures hidden behind closed doors, missions that never made it, and lives lost in pursuit of the stars. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more journeys through forgotten pasts and cosmic dreams. And let us know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, dim your lights, take a deep breath, and let your mind drift weightlessly. Tonight, we're soaring beyond the atmosphere, into history, into hope, and into the silent beauty of the space race. The space race didn't begin with rockets. It began with fear. It began with suspicion, sweaty palms in government offices, and two superpowers staring across oceans and continents at one another with narrowed eyes and clenched teeth. When World War II ended, the United States and the Soviet Union stepped out of the ashes as two victorious giants and almost immediately started side-eyeing each other like roommates who both claimed the bigger bedroom. There was no formal declaration of the Cold War. No one rang a bell or announced that the world was now divided into Team Capitalism and Team Communism. But by the late 1940s, it was clear that peace was going to be competitive. The old wartime allies quickly turned rivals. It wasn't enough to be strong. You had to be stronger. It wasn't enough to win. You had to win louder, in full view of the world. So naturally, when the military strength of each side reached terrifying levels, nuclear bombs stockpiled like canned food, long-range missiles ready to launch at a moment's notice, attention turned upward. Not just for inspiration, but for strategy. If you could control space, you might control everything. The high ground, after all, is the best seat in the house, especially when you're holding a rocket that could, hypothetically, drop something unpleasant on your enemy from orbit. But before space could be controlled, it had to be entered. And while the idea of sending something or someone into space had long lived in the pages of science fiction, turning that dream into a functioning machine was another matter. It would require money, genius, metal, fuel, and a level of national obsession usually reserved for royal weddings and alien sightings. That obsession was fueled by ideology. The Soviet Union wanted to prove that communism could build not only tanks and tractors, but rockets that could pierce the heavens. The United States wanted to prove that freedom and capitalism were not only morally superior, but also technically unstoppable. It wasn't just about science. It was about pride. It was about flags and parades and speeches that started with, "We choose to go to the moon," and ended with thunderous applause. Behind the scenes, both nations scrambled to recruit scientists who could help them reach space first. Some of these scientists were homegrown. Others had more complicated pasts, particularly the German ones. Wernher von Braun, for instance, had built rockets for Nazi Germany before being recruited by the United States under Operation Paperclip. Let's just say his resume had some footnotes. The early days of the space race were quiet, but not uneventful. There were test flights, experimental rockets, and the occasional very loud failure that reminded everyone just how complicated gravity could be when you try to outrun it. Rocket science, as it turned out, was exactly as hard as people said it was. Sometimes you pressed the button and watched your creation soar into the sky. Sometimes you pressed the button and created a very expensive firework. And then came the moment that lit the fuse under the whole affair. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. It was a metal sphere about the size of a beach ball, with 4 antennae sticking out of it like insect legs. It was not fancy. It had no passengers, no weapons, not even a camera. But it had one thing that mattered. It worked. Sputnik entered Earth's orbit and began sending out radio beeps that could be picked up by anyone with the right equipment. It beeped, and it orbited, and the world gasped. In Moscow, the celebration was immediate. Soviet newspapers proudly declared that communism had reached space. Khrushchev grinned for days. In Washington, the reaction was somewhat less joyful. Panic spread like static through the halls of government. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, what else could they launch? Missiles? Cameras? Spies? Space lasers? No one knew for sure, but the anxiety was real and growing. The media jumped in. Headlines screamed that America was falling behind. Children in school were taught to duck and cover, just in case Sputnik decided to do something more aggressive than beep. Congress called emergency hearings. Senators demanded answers. The president's advisors scrambled to calm the public while also quietly asking their scientists how soon they could catch up. It wasn't just about the satellite. It was about what it symbolized. The Soviet Union had won the first point, and that victory stung. Americans had always seen themselves as the pioneers, the inventors, the people who went places no one else could, and suddenly the other guy had beaten them to space. This single event changed everything. It turned cautious exploration into urgent competition. It shifted space research from academic corners into the spotlight. It gave engineers and scientists a blank check and a marching order. Get up there, fast. In the Soviet Union, the success of Sputnik led to more launches, including Sputnik 2, which carried a passenger Laika the dog. Poor Laika, a stray plucked from the streets of Moscow, became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. She also became a symbol, a hero, and later a tragic footnote. She did not survive the mission, but her journey proved that life could exist, however briefly, in space. In the United States, the response came in the form of new agencies, new programs, and a surge of investment. The most famous creation was NASA, formed in 1958. It replaced the earlier, more modest National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and was given a singular purpose: beat the Soviets. NASA gathered scientists, engineers, test pilots, and administrators into one cohesive machine. It began to test new rockets, build launch facilities, and plan missions that would not only match Soviet achievements but leapfrog over them entirely. The mood was now electric. Children dreamed of becoming astronauts. Toy companies released rocket sets. Television aired space-themed dramas. Every headline from Cape Canaveral became a national event. The space race was no longer just a strategic goal. It had become a cultural obsession. And yet, for all the fire and energy, this was still only the beginning. The road to the moon and the stories, theories, and controversies that would come with it had barely begun. For every launch that soared, another exploded. For every cheer, there was a hush of nervous breath. In the next part of this story, we will follow the beeping ball that started it all and how one floating signal from the stars turned an invisible Cold War into a visible contest for the heavens. When Sputnik began its lonely circuit around Earth in October of 1957, it was not much to look at. A shiny silver ball, less than 2 feet in diameter, trailed 4 long, spindly antennae and weighed about 180 pounds. It beeped. That was it. Just a repeating signal, a robotic heartbeat from space. But those beeps echoed far louder than their simple tone suggested. For the United States and much of the Western world, those beeps sounded like footsteps behind you in a dark alley, distant but steadily getting closer. At first, there was disbelief. Surely it was just Soviet propaganda, a bluff, a decoy balloon maybe. But then radio operators, amateur and professional, began to pick up the signals. The satellite was real. It was circling the planet every 96 minutes, passing silently overhead while people below craned their necks to the sky and wondered what would come next. In classrooms, teachers tried to answer questions they were not trained to handle. In Washington, military analysts pulled all-nighters, poring over Soviet launch data and trying not to show their panic. President Eisenhower was briefed by his advisors in a tone usually reserved for natural disasters. The Soviets had not only entered space first, they had done it smoothly, cleanly, on schedule. That was the part that truly scared people. It was not a fluke, it was a capability. Americans were used to being first in cars, first in fast food, first in baseball and jazz. So to wake up one morning and find that the Soviet Union had beaten them into space felt like more than just a scientific loss. It felt like a national embarrassment. A wake-up call that hit with the cold slap of physics and pride. The public reaction was swift and chaotic. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Red Moon over U.S. Soviets launch Earth satellite. Eisenhower caught napping. Radio talk shows filled with speculation. Were the Soviets spying on American cities from orbit? Could they drop bombs from space? Could they watch us through our own television sets? One particularly enthusiastic letter to a New York editor asked whether Sputnik had already started turning the sky red. The panic was not always logical, but it was widespread. The fact that the satellite had no camera, no weapons, and no steering mechanism did little to calm the nerves. It was not about what Sputnik could do. It was about what it meant. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch a missile. If they could launch a missile, they could hit New York or Washington or anywhere in between. The psychological weight of that reality landed like a meteor. And just when things were beginning to settle, the Soviets did it again. On November 3, 1957, less than a month after Sputnik 1, they launched Sputnik 2. This time it was bigger, heavier, more complex, and it carried a passenger. Laika was a stray dog plucked from the streets of Moscow. Small, calm, and obedient, she was chosen not for her loyalty or patriotism, but for her size and temperament. The Soviets wanted to see how a living being would fare in space. Laika was trained in increasingly tight quarters, taught to remain still for long periods, and eventually placed in a pressurized capsule atop a rocket. The mission, though tragic, was technically a success. Laika survived the launch and spent several hours in orbit. Unfortunately, due to a design flaw in the capsule's cooling system, she died from overheating not long after reaching space. The Soviet government kept this fact quiet at the time, reporting that she had been humanely euthanized before her oxygen ran out. The truth, as it often does in these stories, came out decades later. Laika became a global symbol of courage, of sacrifice, and of a space race that was quickly accelerating into something larger than anyone had predicted. In the West, her image appeared in cartoons, magazines, and school books. Some children wrote songs for her, others named their pets after her. She was the first true space traveler, and though she never came back, her story stayed with the world. Back in the United States, the pressure to respond had reached boiling point. It was not just the government that felt it, it was the entire country. Funding for science and engineering programs surged overnight. New scholarships were created. Teachers were sent back to school to learn how to teach physics properly. Suddenly, every child was expected to become a rocket scientist, or at least think about becoming one. Congress held hearings. Committees formed. The press asked pointed questions. Why were American rockets still blowing up on the launch pad? Why had the Navy's Vanguard program failed so spectacularly just weeks after Sputnik? On live television, Vanguard lifted off the ground only a few feet before sputtering, stalling, and collapsing in a ball of flame. The satellite inside rolled pathetically across the ground. The world watched, and the Soviets laughed politely, but loudly. It was in this climate that the United States decided to get serious. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was born in July of 1958. It absorbed the older NACA agency and was given one primary mission: catch up fast. American rocket programs were reorganized, streamlined, and funded like never before. Top pilots were recruited. Engineers were told to push every limit. The moon was not yet the goal, but the stars were finally in focus. There was also a shift in tone. Space was no longer just a military theater. It was a place of wonder, a place of destiny. The rhetoric changed. It became about exploration, about pushing the boundaries of what humans could achieve. Yes, there was still the Cold War behind it, all the ticking clock, the silent tension, but now there was also something hopeful, something almost romantic about reaching for the heavens. Still, the fear lingered. In homes, parents looked up at the night sky and wondered if Sputnik or its successors were watching. Children had dreams of floating in space and nightmares of atomic bombs falling from the stars. Schools ran drills, governments kept secrets. And all the while, both nations pushed forward, each step fueled by the other's shadow. The space race had truly begun, and it would not be a sprint. It would be a marathon of machines, minds, and moments that would shape not only the Cold War, but the future of humanity itself. In the next part, we will step into the lives of the men chosen to become the first astronauts, the daredevils, the dreamers, and the reluctant heroes who would risk everything to ride rockets into the unknown. Before anyone could go to space, they had to convince someone to get inside a metal canister strapped to a controlled explosion and hope for the best. It sounds glamorous now, the suits, the ceremonies. the slow-motion footage of liftoff. But back in the early days, becoming an astronaut was more about nerves of steel, the ability to sit still for hours, and a stomach that could survive the ride. After the launch of Sputnik and the growing fear that the Soviet Union was pulling ahead, the United States decided it needed heroes, not just engineers or generals or politicians. It needed people, faces, names, Americans who could look into a television camera and say with quiet confidence, "Yes, I'm about to sit on top of a rocket that might explode, and I'm doing it for my country." That call went out in the spring of 1959. The newly formed NASA announced the creation of Project Mercury, the first American human spaceflight program. The goal was simple and ambitious: put a man in space and bring him back alive, preferably in that order. 7 men were chosen for this task. They became known as the Mercury 7. All of them were military test pilots. All of them were white. All of them were men. And all of them had one thing in common: an almost absurd tolerance for risk. These were men who had flown experimental aircraft at the edge of the atmosphere, sometimes upside down, sometimes on fire, and usually without blinking. Their names became legendary in time: Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton. At the time, they were just pilots, sitting in a room with government doctors, poking them, measuring them, and asking invasive questions about how well their bodies held up under pressure, sleep deprivation, and very bad food. The medical tests were thorough, to put it mildly. They were poked with needles, spun in centrifuges, and made to swallow balloons to measure stomach gases. One astronaut famously said that the doctors seemed determined to find out what it would take to make a man go insane and then select only those who didn't. Beyond the medical trials were the simulations. These were meant to prepare the astronauts for what space would feel like, even though no one really knew what space would feel like, so they guessed. They built mock cockpits. They used harnesses and cables to simulate weightlessness. They put the astronauts in isolation chambers to see how long it would take before the average man started talking to the walls. And then there were the training flights. High-altitude jets, parabolic arcs to mimic zero gravity, and lots of time in cramped simulators. One pilot described the experience of training for space as flying inside a washing machine filled with sandbags. And yet they kept showing up, every morning, smiling, joking, trying to look like they were enjoying themselves, even as the sweat rolled down their backs and their hearts pounded at the thought of what was coming. The Soviets, meanwhile, were conducting their own training, though, true to form. They kept most of it secret. Their first cosmonauts were chosen with a similar mindset: test pilots, young, disciplined, and ideally small enough to fit inside a spacecraft barely wider than a kitchen sink. The first man selected for flight was Yuri Gagarin, a Russian pilot with a winning smile, a quiet demeanor, and a name that would soon be known around the world. Gagarin trained in a facility near Moscow, running through the same kinds of trials as his American counterparts: isolation, centrifuge rides, survival training in case he landed in a forest, desert, or the sea. There's even a story, probably exaggerated, but fun nonetheless, that Soviet cosmonauts were required to survive alone in Siberia for days with nothing but a knife and a pack of matches, just in case their capsule got confused and landed somewhere extremely inconvenient. Both programs, American and Soviet, were pushing their people and their machines to the limit. Rockets were still unreliable. Parachutes sometimes failed. Heat shields occasionally cracked. Simulations caught fire. There was a constant, unspoken question hovering in the air. Would the first person to reach space return in triumph or as a cloud of ash? The pressure was immense, not just on the astronauts and cosmonauts, but on everyone involved. Engineers worked endless shifts, scribbling calculations by hand, checking and rechecking every circuit. Mission planners debated over every button and every bolt. Politicians gave speeches about courage and destiny while quietly asking if maybe, just maybe, this was all a little premature. Publicly, the tone was all pride and patriotism. These were pioneers, charting a new frontier. The final frontier, some said, but behind the scenes nerves frayed, tempers flared. There were arguments about which design was safest, about how much risk was too much, about whether anyone really knew what would happen once a man left the atmosphere and looked down on the Earth from above. Yet despite the chaos, or maybe because of it, a strange camaraderie formed. The astronauts, for all their differences, became a team. They teased each other, competed with each other, and supported each other. When one of them was chosen for a mission, the others did not sulk. They trained harder, knowing their turn might be next if they were lucky, and if nothing went wrong. The American public, meanwhile, was watching with growing fascination. The Mercury 7 became celebrities almost overnight. They appeared in magazines, gave interviews, and signed autographs for children who now dreamed of becoming astronauts themselves. They were seen as brave, clean-cut heroes men who had left behind the sky to reach for the stars. Of course, the astronauts knew better. They knew the odds. They saw the test flights that ended badly. They heard the hushed tones when an engine failed. They understood, more than anyone, that space was not a guaranteed adventure. It was a gamble, a leap of faith held together by math, metal, and hope. Still, they pushed forward, because behind all the flags, the politics, and the television cameras, there was a simple truth. They wanted to go. They wanted to see what was out there. They wanted to look back at Earth from the edge of space and say, without doubt, that they had been part of something bigger than fear. In the next part of this story, we will follow that journey upward to the moment when a rocket launched from Earth and carried a man beyond the sky, into the blackness of space, and into history. On July 20th, 1969, two men climbed down a ladder and stepped into legend. They did it slowly, carefully, and in slightly awkward fashion, because gravity was not quite behaving the way they were used to. Still, when Neil Armstrong took that first step onto the powdery gray surface of the moon, he left more than just a footprint. He left a mark on the imagination of every person watching from Earth. The road to that moment had been long, dangerous, and expensive. It began with speeches and rockets that failed more often than they worked. But Apollo 11 was different. It was the moment everything was building toward. It was a promise made under pressure, delivered in black and white, beamed across millions of televisions, narrated in calm, clipped voices through the static of deep space. To the outside world, it looked smooth, but inside the spacecraft, the experience was something else entirely. The Apollo 11 crew, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, had spent months training for every possible scenario. They had practiced moonwalks in the deserts of Arizona, rehearsed docking maneuvers in giant swimming pools, and studied every nut and bolt of their spacecraft. They knew the weight of each button. They could recite emergency protocols in their sleep, and sometimes they had to. The journey to the moon began with a roar. The Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever launched by humans at the time, stood over 300 feet tall. At launch, it weighed more than 6 million pounds. It was not elegant. It was controlled fury, a carefully timed explosion that punched through the atmosphere with fire and thunder. Inside, the astronauts were essentially strapped into a very complicated tin can on top of a massive fuel tank. The launch was not smooth. It shook. It rattled. There was pressure in their chests and sweat on their brows. But when they reached orbit and looked out the window, the Earth was a blue and white marble, silent and distant. The Moon, their destination, was still 3 days away. Those 3 days were spent in a spacecraft the size of a large closet. The astronauts floated, ate paste from pouches, and monitored instruments with the precision of men who knew how little separated them from disaster. Michael Collins remained in the command module, Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the lunar module, Eagle, and began their descent. The landing itself was anything but routine. The onboard computer began throwing out error codes. The module was descending faster than expected, and as they came closer to the surface, Armstrong noticed they were headed straight for a crater filled with boulders the size of refrigerators. He took manual control, flying sideways, low on fuel, scanning for a flat spot. Mission control back in Houston was silent, tense. They had less than 30 seconds of fuel left when Armstrong finally said, "Contact light." Then, a pause. Then, the words that echoed around the world. "The Eagle has landed." Back on Earth, people exhaled. Cheers erupted in control rooms and living rooms. Strangers hugged. Children were allowed to stay up late. Entire families huddled around grainy televisions, eyes wide, breath held. This was not a moment for one country. This was a moment for everyone. Humanity had made it to the Moon. When Armstrong climbed down the ladder and set foot on the lunar surface, he said the words everyone now knows: "That's one small step for man, the one giant leap for mankind." There was some confusion over whether he said a man or just man, but the message was clear. Something historic had just happened. Buzz Aldrin followed shortly after. He described the lunar surface as magnificent desolation. That might sound poetic, but it was also accurate. The Moon was silent, dusty, and alien. The sky was black. The stars were invisible in the brightness of their landing zone, and the ground was a fine powder that clung to their suits. The astronauts bounced gently in the low gravity, moving more like cautious deer than men. They planted the American flag, which, thanks to a horizontal rod, looked like it was waving even though there was no wind. They conducted experiments, set up instruments, took photographs, and collected samples. They left behind a plaque that read, "We came in peace for all mankind." And they were not alone. At least, not if you ask the conspiracy theorists. It did not take long after the Moon landing for rumors to begin. Some said the flag was moving proof, they claimed. That wind was blowing, and therefore it must have been filmed on Earth. Others pointed out the lack of stars in the photos, insisting that NASA had faked the whole thing on a soundstage. A few even claimed filmmaker Stanley Kubrick was hired to direct the lunar hoax between shoots for 2001, A Space Odyssey. NASA responded with patience, showing physics, data, and the testimony of thousands of engineers. The moon rocks brought back were studied and confirmed by scientists around the world. The retroreflectors placed on the lunar surface could be targeted with lasers from Earth. Still, the rumors lingered. Because, let's face it, conspiracy theories have a certain charm, especially when they let people feel like they know something the rest of the world missed. The truth, though, is more impressive than fiction. The moon landing happened because thousands of people worked for years, often in silence, solving problems that had never existed before. It happened because of pilots who stayed calm, engineers who refused to settle, and a public who believed that reaching the moon was worth trying even if they were not sure it was possible. After less than 24 hours on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back into the Eagle. They rested briefly, then launched from the moon to rejoin Collins, who had been orbiting alone, staring down at the lunar landscape with equal parts awe and envy. The reunion was smooth. The trip home was quiet. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean and were pulled aboard an aircraft carrier as heroes. Around the world, the headlines rolled in. Man had walked on the moon. The United States had taken a bold step in the space race. But more than that, it felt like humanity had peeked through a doorway. If we could go there, where else might we go? What else might we discover? In the next part of this story, we will explore the Soviet response, not just the launches that worked, but the ones that did not. The hidden failures, the secret missions, and the moments when even the most confident engineers held their breath. Because while the world watched Apollo 11, something very different was happening behind the Iron Curtain. While the world watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin leave boot prints on the moon in the summer of 1969, Soviet engineers and officials watched with a mixture of admiration, frustration, and disbelief. The moon had once seemed within their grasp. Now it was someone else's flag flapping gently in the stillness, and the race, at least in the eyes of the public, seemed over. But the Soviet story was far from finished. In fact, behind the Iron Curtain, another race had been running all along. It was quieter, less polished, and far more secretive. For every Soviet success that made headlines like Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, there were failures tucked neatly into locked files and whispered conversations. Rockets that exploded on the launch pad. Prototypes that never left the ground. Cosmonauts who trained for missions that were canceled without ceremony. The Soviet space program was driven by both ambition and politics. Nikita Khrushchev and later Leonid Brezhnev saw space as a tool not just of science, but of ideology. Beating the Americans into orbit had been a powerful statement. Beating them to the moon would have been even better. But behind the scenes, the Soviet system was struggling to deliver on those dreams. The biggest obstacle was not a lack of courage, it was chaos. Unlike NASA, which was a single centralized agency coordinating efforts across the country, the Soviet space program was divided between competing design bureaus. The most famous of these was led by Sergei Korolev, the chief architect of the early Soviet triumphs. Korolev was a brilliant engineer, but even brilliance has its limits, especially when buried under bureaucracy and secrecy. Korolev had been imprisoned during Stalin's purges, beaten and left to rot in a gulag before being quietly released when someone remembered how good he was at building rockets. His identity was kept secret for years, known to the public only as the chief designer. Even within the space program, there were rumors about who he really was. Some thought he had died long ago and been replaced. Others thought he was a committee, not a person. Despite this, he led the Soviet Union through one success after another until his unexpected death in 1966. His absence created a power vacuum. The different bureaus began to pull in different directions. There was no clear leadership, no unified vision. The moon still beckoned, but the road toward it became tangled. One of the greatest hopes for a Soviet moon landing rested on the Nun rocket. This was their answer to the Saturn V, a colossal booster designed to carry cosmonauts to the lunar surface and back. On paper, it looked promising. It had more engines. It had more thrust. It had been painted and photographed from flattering angles. In practice, the Nun was a disaster. The first Nun test launch in 1969 ended in an enormous explosion just seconds after liftoff. The rocket rose a few dozen feet, shuddered, and fell back onto the launch pad, destroying the entire complex in what some witnesses described as a fireball that briefly turned night into day. The second launch also failed. So did the third, and the fourth. Not one Nun rocket ever made it successfully into space. Each failure was kept under wraps. Official statements were vague or silent. Photographs were classified. Meanwhile, American television showed astronauts driving a lunar rover across the moon's surface while millions watched with popcorn in hand. Soviet citizens got poetry about stars and hopeful cartoons of future space stations. The contrast was hard to miss. It wasn't just the rockets that struggled. The Soviet lunar lander, the LK, was smaller and more fragile than its American counterpart. It could carry only one cosmonaut. Its testing process was rushed and secretive. Only unmanned versions ever flew. Cosmonauts trained for it, learned the controls, suited up, and waited for the call. That call never came. And yet, the Soviet Union continued pushing forward, because failure was never meant to be admitted. Within the system, acknowledging setbacks could be career-ending, or worse. Engineers worked with limited budgets, outdated tools, and the constant knowledge that success would be public, but failure would be invisible or erased entirely. One infamous example was the story of Valentin Bondarenko. A young cosmonaut in training, Bondarenko died in 1961 after a fire broke out in an oxygen-rich testing chamber. His suit caught fire. The door was sealed. By the time anyone reached him, it was too late. His death was kept secret for decades. Only in the 1980s did his name become public. There were others, 2 test pilots, technicians, unnamed figures whose sacrifices were not recorded in newspapers or documentaries, but in quietly buried reports. Despite the setbacks, there were moments of brilliance. The Soviet Union sent the first probes to impact the moon, the first to photograph the far side, and the first to land a robotic rover, the Lunokhod, which trundled across the lunar surface like a metallic crab, controlled from Earth. These robotic missions were successful and scientifically valuable, but they were not enough to erase the sense of being second. Cosmonauts like Alexei Leonov, who became the first human to conduct a spacewalk, were national heroes, but they also knew how close they had come to disaster. Leonov's suit expanded in the vacuum of space, making it nearly impossible for him to re-enter the airlock. He had to bleed off oxygen, risking unconsciousness, to make it back inside. These missions were brave, but they were often held together by last-minute fixes and raw courage. In public, the Soviet space program was presented as flawless. Behind the scenes, it was a patchwork of bold ideas, political pressure, and tireless work under impossible conditions. The engineers were smart. The cosmonauts were brave. But they were fighting against a system that valued success more than safety and secrecy more than honesty. By the early 1970s, the dream of beating America to the moon was quietly shelved. The last Nun rocket was retired without fanfare. The lunar lander was packed away. The Soviet focus shifted to space stations to orbit, research, and long-term presence above the Earth. It was a smart pivot, and one that would bear fruit in later decades. But the truth remained. The moon had been a race, and they had lost. Still, the legacy of those years is not one of failure. It is one of effort, flawed, heroic, secretive, and sometimes heartbreaking. The Soviet space program showed what humans could do under pressure. It showed the risks they would take and the price they would pay. And in the next part, we will explore what happened after the dust settled. Because while the race to the moon ended in triumph for one side and silence for the other, the impact of the space race did not stop in the 1970s. Its echoes are still with us in science, in politics, in culture, and in the way we look at the stars and wonder what comes next. When the dust of the moon landings finally settled and the roar of rockets quieted, the world did not wake up the next morning with a permanent outpost on the lunar surface. There were no colonies, no moon bases with little domes and red blinking lights, no futuristic cities on Mars. The space race, so urgent in the 1960s, seemed to have sprinted to a glorious climax and then taken a long nap. But what it left behind was not silence. It was infrastructure. It was inspiration. It was a shift in how people thought about technology, exploration, and our place in the universe. The race to space may have slowed down, but its legacy had just begun to take root. After Apollo 11, there were more moon missions, 5 more successful landings through 1972, and one near disaster, Apollo 13, which had everything but a landing. Each mission brought back more data, more rocks, more stories. But interest, both public and political, began to fade. The American public had seen the moon landing. They had been dazzled. And then, in a very human way, they asked, "What's next?" The truth was, no one quite knew. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had quietly changed direction. After the failures of the Nun rocket and the cancellation of their moon program, Soviet engineers turned their focus to something more sustainable: long-term space stations. In 1971, they launched Salyut 1, the first space station. It was not flashy. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and smelled, according to one cosmonaut, like wet socks, old electronics, and cabbage. But it was the beginning of something lasting. That idea, living and working in space for extended periods, became the new frontier. In the years that followed, both nations launched a series of increasingly complex orbiting labs. The United States answered with Skylab. The Soviets followed with a growing line of Salyut stations and eventually the much larger Mir, which would float above Earth for 15 years. The competition gradually gave way to collaboration. The Cold War tension that had once fueled the space race began to thaw, and the once radical idea of American astronauts flying alongside Russian cosmonauts became a reality. In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project brought the two sides together in orbit. A docking module bridged their incompatible spacecraft. The two commanders shook hands. It was both symbolic and practical, a nod that space, at least, might be big enough for everyone. Back on Earth, the impact of the space race began to ripple into everyday life. The technologies developed for space, once exotic and top secret, began to find new homes in regular things. Satellite communication, GPS navigation, weather forecasting, digital imaging, and even the materials in your sneakers or the memory foam in your pillow all owe something to the push that started with a metal sphere called Sputnik. Culturally, space exploration became a fixture. The grainy footage of Armstrong on the moon was replayed in classrooms for decades. Movies imagined Mars colonies and asteroid miners. Kids dressed as astronauts for Halloween. The phrase space age came to mean anything modern, sleek, or vaguely futuristic. And yet, for a long time, space remained a place where governments led and the rest of us just watched. Then, slowly, the game changed again. In the late 20th and early 21st century, the baton began to pass from government agencies to private companies. What once required an army of engineers and a federal budget began to attract ambitious entrepreneurs with bold visions and even bolder press releases. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and later Rocket Lab and others entered the scene not just to assist NASA, but to become space agencies of their own. These companies brought with them a new kind of energy. Rockets that could land themselves, missions launched on Instagram Live, Tesla Roadsters orbiting the sun. Critics raised eyebrows. Traditionalists sighed. But the numbers did not lie. Launch costs dropped. Innovation accelerated. A new generation started watching again, not out of Cold War loyalty, but out of curiosity and wonder. Meanwhile, governments did not step away. NASA continued developing new spacecraft, including the Orion capsule and the Artemis program, which aims to return humans to the moon in the coming years. China entered the field in a big way, launching its own astronauts, building its own space station, and landing rovers on the moon and Mars. India launched missions with growing ambition and precision. The European Space Agency expanded its partnerships. The cosmos had become a crowded, collaborative neighborhood. And yet, the ghost of the original space race still lingers. The idea that space is not just a scientific frontier, but a geopolitical one continues to shape conversations. Nations talk about space dominance. Defense departments monitor satellites like chess pieces. There are questions about mining rights on the moon, about who controls lunar resources, about whether Mars will belong to anyone or everyone. There are still those who doubt, those who say the moon landings were faked in a Hollywood basement, that the shadows are wrong, that the flag was waving. These theories, persistent and creatively imaginative, have fueled documentaries, debates, and more than a few late-night arguments. NASA has responded patiently, offering facts, physics, and photographs. But the conspiracies never fully go away, perhaps because the truth itself still feels too grand to be real. And it is grand. A handful of humans left Earth, crossed hundreds of thousands of miles of empty space, and walked on another world. They did it not because it was easy, but because it was necessary to prove something, to learn something, to become something more. That spirit remains. In every launch, every rover, every telescope scanning the skies, there is a thread that traces back to the 1960s. A time when two nations pointed rockets at the stars, not to destroy each other, but to see who could touch the sky first. A time when fear gave way to awe, and awe gave way to achievement. The legacy of the space race is not just in the footprints left on the moon or the satellites orbiting overhead. It is in the way people look up, in the way a child stares at the night sky and asks, "What's out there?" It is in the quiet, unshakable belief that there is always more to explore. And in the next part of this story, we will return to Earth, to the people whose lives were changed forever by their journey into space, and to the quiet moments when they looked back at our little blue planet and saw, for the first time, just how small and beautiful home really is. For all the fire, fury, and engineering brilliance it took to get a human into space, there's one detail that no rocket scientist could ever fully prepare for what happens inside a person once they leave Earth. That part, the internal shift, the emotional gravity, the sheer scope of it all, tends to unfold quietly. Not in the cockpit, not on the launch pad, but in the silence between thoughts, often when they're already halfway to the moon. The men and eventually the women who traveled into space during the height of the space race were trained to stay calm. They were selected for their discipline, their technical skill, their ability to keep a cool head even when alarms blared and countdowns faltered. But all the training in the world could not prepare them for the moment when they looked out the window and saw Earth for what it truly was. A sphere, a fragile, floating marble, not a continent, not a country, just one planet, blue, white, a little green, wrapped in a paper-thin film of atmosphere, surrounded by black. Astronauts described the feeling in different ways: awe, humility, a kind of stunned reverence. Many called it the overview effect, the sudden, irreversible shift in awareness that comes from seeing the Earth without borders, without divisions, without all the noise we fill our lives with down here. From space, Earth does not look political. It looks peaceful, tiny, vulnerable, beautiful. Buzz Aldrin called it magnificent desolation. Michael Collins, who stayed behind in lunar orbit while his crewmates walked on the moon, spoke of the deep, aching loneliness of that moment, not just of being alone in the spacecraft, but of feeling, for a time, like the loneliest human in the universe. And yet he also called it the most profound peace he had ever known. Back on Earth, these stories filtered into classrooms, television interviews, and late-night conversations. Children listened to astronauts speak and suddenly saw science not as cold equations, but as a doorway to wonder. Adults who had never thought about stars now found themselves buying telescopes. The people who went to space came back not as explorers in the traditional sense, but as messengers. They had seen something, and even if they could not quite explain it, they wanted to share it. Of course, not every astronaut came home unchanged in the same way. Some struggled. Re-entry into Earth's atmosphere is fast and hot, but re-entry into normal life can be even harder. After walking on the moon or floating in orbit, returning to traffic lights and grocery lists can feel jarring. There were astronauts who wrestled with depression, with expectations, with a sense that their greatest moment had already passed. Buzz Aldrin spoke openly about his post-Apollo struggles. He had been to the moon and back, and then he found himself fighting addiction, wrestling with purpose, wondering what came next. He was not alone. Others felt similar disorientation. Some found new callings, writing, teaching, inspiring the next generation. Others quietly retreated from the spotlight, content to let the history books speak for them. In the Soviet Union, cosmonauts were celebrated, but they also operated under stricter rules. Public image was tightly controlled. Failures were hidden. personal struggles were often buried beneath the surface. Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, became a national treasure, but he was grounded from future space flights to protect his life and preserve his image. He died tragically in a plane crash in 1968, just a year before the moon landing, leaving behind a legacy both heroic and heartbreaking. The psychological weight of space travel is still something scientists and mission planners study today. Extended missions aboard space stations like Mir and the International Space Station have shown just how mentally taxing it can be to live in a small, enclosed space for months on end. The camaraderie helps. So do routines. But sometimes astronauts simply miss the wind, the smell of grass, the feeling of standing still on solid ground. And yet, almost without exception, they want to go back. Because, for all its challenges, space offers something no other experience can: perspective. That word comes up again and again in interviews. Perspective on the planet, perspective on humanity, perspective on the ridiculousness of so many things we treat as urgent or permanent. From space, national borders are invisible. Arguments seem smaller. Fears seem quieter. Life seems singular. Shared. Even the most scientifically minded astronauts have spoken about space in spiritual terms. They talk about interconnectedness, about feeling part of something larger than themselves. They do not all agree on what that something is, but they agree that it matters, that the experience of seeing Earth from the outside changes how you live inside it. This is perhaps one of the quiet legacies of the space race. Not just the rockets or the satellites, not just the hardware or the headlines, but the human stories. The emotional fallout of touching the stars and then coming home again. The invisible souvenirs they brought back with them, a new sense of time, of place, of purpose. Those stories rippled outward, into art, into music, into how people told stories about the universe. Science fiction became more grounded, more hopeful, more human. Writers imagined futures where space was not just a battlefield but a community. Movies tried to capture the silence, the stillness, the sheer immensity of it all. Some got it right, some made things explode. Even those who never went to space felt the impact. Farmers began using satellite data to monitor crops. Students studied astronomy because of the excitement sparked by Apollo. Entire industries were shaped by the tools first developed to keep humans alive in zero gravity. But above all, the legacy was emotional. It was the shift in how people saw themselves not as residents of a country, but as passengers on a shared planet, spinning silently in a vast and complicated universe. In the next part, we will explore how that emotional legacy sparked a new wave of exploration not to the moon, but deeper into the solar system, toward planets, asteroids, and the thin, distant edge of our own cosmic neighborhood. Because once you've looked back at Earth, the next question is inevitable. What else is out there? As the dust of the moon settled, and the glory of Apollo began to fade into textbooks and grainy documentaries, space itself did not become quieter. It simply got more crowded. Though the United States and the Soviet Union had defined the early chapters of the space race, they would not be the only ones to keep writing. Other nations, motivated by ambition, security, prestige, or curiosity, began to look up at the sky and see something more than stars. They saw a battlefield, a laboratory, a stage. By the late 1970s, the Cold War had not eased as much as it had spread. The arms race continued to push the two superpowers toward newer and more advanced missile systems, many of which shared their technological roots with space launch vehicles. A missile that could deliver a warhead across the globe was not all that different from a rocket that could launch a satellite into orbit. The lines blurred. The terminology changed depending on whether the payload was peaceful or not. This overlap gave rise to what was quietly referred to as the militarization of space. Both the United States and the Soviet Union began placing more and more resources into what they called reconnaissance satellites. These were, in simple terms, eyes in the sky. They could photograph enemy bases, track missile movements, and monitor troop deployments in near real time, and they were fast. Much faster than a spy plane could ever dream to be. This technology was kept classified, but its existence was no secret. By the early 1980s, both sides were watching each other from above with such intensity that it bordered on obsessive. It was not just about missiles anymore. It was about knowing, seeing, staying one step ahead. Then came the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known by its Hollywood nickname, Star Wars. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan proposed a program that would, in theory, create a space-based shield capable of shooting down incoming nuclear missiles before they could reach American soil. The vision was bold, dramatic, and utterly cinematic. Lasers in orbit, satellites with tracking systems, a technological barrier that would render nuclear weapons obsolete. The Soviet response was panic and ridicule in equal measure. Some Soviet scientists genuinely feared that the United States was about to leap ahead in a way that could not be matched. Others rolled their eyes and pointed out, with quiet confidence, that most of the proposed technology did not actually exist. Not yet, maybe not ever. Still, the very idea of space-based weapons pushed the conversation in a new direction. If one country could place a defensive system in orbit, what was stopping another from placing an offensive one? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 had banned the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but it did not ban all weapons. And as always, interpretation mattered more than ink on paper. This period of the Cold War saw a quiet but intense effort from both superpowers to experiment with space-based defense systems. The United States tested satellites capable of maneuvering and even grappling with other satellites. The Soviets explored ground-based systems that could blind or disable American assets in orbit. Neither side admitted much, but both were fully aware that space had become a new theater of potential conflict. Beyond the rivalry of the two giants, other countries began entering the space race with less drama but no less determination. France launched its first satellite, Asterix, in 1965, becoming the third nation to reach space independently. China followed in 1970, sending a satellite called Dongfang Hong 1 into orbit. Japan launched its first satellite, Osumi, around the same time. These new spacefaring nations were not aiming for the moon. They were aiming for capability, sovereignty. The ability to say, "We too can reach orbit without help." It was not just a matter of pride. It was about independence in telecommunications, weather forecasting, navigation, and yes, national defense. India joined the list in the early 1980s. So did Israel. Each of these nations approached space through its own lens, shaped by its geography, politics, and resources. But all of them shared the underlying belief that space was no longer a frontier. It was now a strategic domain like air, sea, and land. By the end of the Cold War, dozens of countries had launched satellites. Most of them used foreign rockets, American, Russian, European, but the trend was clear. The monopoly of space access was breaking. Private companies had not yet stepped onto the stage, but the curtain was starting to lift. Even cooperation during this era was often colored by competition. The European Space Agency, formed in 1975, brought together multiple European countries in a joint space effort. It was framed as a peaceful collaboration, and it was. But it was also a strategic move to stay relevant in a world increasingly shaped by orbital power. Every new satellite launched, even those with weather instruments or educational payloads, told the same story. We are watching, we are learning, and we are present. There were even whispers and the occasional speech about the possibility of space-based attacks. What if a country could disable another's satellite network before a conflict began? What if communications, GPS systems, or even early warning radars were wiped out in the first minutes of a war? This was no longer science fiction. This was doctrine. Through it all, the moon remained untouched. No one returned after 1972, not because we had forgotten it, but because the priorities had changed. Earth orbit had become the new high ground. Control over it meant control over information, communication, and timing. That mattered more to military planners than flags on lunar soil. Still, the legacy of the space race lingered. It was not just about firsts anymore. It was about permanence, infrastructure, strategy. Even when nations shook hands in space like the United States and the Soviet Union had in the Apollo-Soyuz mission, they kept their other hand hovering near the launch button. As the 20th century neared its end, the world had moved from one race to many. The technology was spreading. The ambition was multiplying. And while the Cold War might have cooled, the race for space and for the power it represented had only grown more complex. In the next part of this story, we will explore how that complexity gave rise to a new age, not just of nations, but of companies, billionaires, and private rockets. Because just as governments began to step back from the spotlight, a new cast of characters was already assembling backstage, ready to take space into their own hands. As the 20th century came to a close, the sky was no longer just the playground of two superpowers. It was getting crowded. Dozens of countries had developed space programs. Satellites orbited in growing numbers. New ambitions were rising from old nations and new ones alike. But with that growth came a shift in tone. Space, once seen as a symbol of unity and inspiration, had become a more complicated place. The race to explore was now shadowed by the race to control. Throughout the Cold War, space had always been a strategic theater. But by the 1990s, it began to look more like a battlefield in waiting. Military commanders started using terms like force enhancement and space superiority. It sounded like something from a science fiction movie, but the reality was more practical and far more serious. Whoever controlled space would control the timing, coordination, and communication of any modern conflict on Earth. The Gulf War in 1991 was one of the first conflicts to show the true power of space-based assets in war. American forces used GPS for targeting, weather satellites for forecasting, and surveillance satellites for intelligence gathering. This was not a war of guesswork, it was a war of precision. Soldiers on the ground knew exactly where they were. Missiles struck with eerie accuracy. Enemy movements were tracked in real time, and behind all of it were satellites spinning silently above. Other nations took notice. China, in particular, began to see the value of space not just for science, but for national security. The Chinese government had been developing its space program for decades, mostly behind the scenes. But by the early 2000s, it began stepping out onto the global stage. In 2003, China became the third country to launch humans into space with its own technology. The message was clear. China was not only watching, it was participating. India was close behind. With its own growing satellite network, India developed launch capabilities, sent probes to the Moon and Mars, and began integrating space technology into both civilian and military systems. Japan and South Korea followed a similar path. Israel launched satellites with impressive resolution. Iran and North Korea made headlines with missile tests that, while described as peaceful, carried the obvious subtext of dual-use technology. And then came the tests, the kind that made people in quiet offices sit up straighter and stop sipping their coffee. In 2007, China launched a missile that intercepted and destroyed one of its own defunct weather satellites. The test was successful, but it created a large cloud of space debris that would remain in orbit for years. It was not just a demonstration of capability, it was a message. If needed, satellites could be targeted and destroyed, and satellites, everyone knew, were now central to nearly every military, economic, and communication system on the planet. The United States responded with its own demonstration the following year, intercepting a malfunctioning satellite with a missile launched from a Navy ship. Officially, it was a safety operation to prevent toxic fuel from reaching the ground. Unofficially, it was proof that the technology worked. The race had quietly escalated. These events marked a shift from space as a high ground to space as a contested domain. Nations began drafting doctrines for space defense. The United States established dedicated commands. Russia revived some of its Cold War-era strategies and began developing advanced anti-satellite systems. China accelerated the development of its space infrastructure, focusing not just on launches, but on redundancy, resilience, and the ability to operate in a degraded space environment. Behind the public missions and peaceful rhetoric, there was a growing awareness that space was vulnerable. Satellites could be jammed, blinded, or hacked. Ground stations could be sabotaged. Communications could be disrupted. And because modern life was so dependent on satellites for GPS, banking, television, weather, and more, the consequences of an attack in space could be catastrophic even without a single shot fired on Earth. Governments started building countermeasures, hardened satellites, backup systems, secure communication networks. There was even talk of deploying small maneuverable satellites that could defend others, or inspect foreign ones, or simply be there in case something happened. The term dual use became common. It meant that a satellite could be used for both peaceful and military purposes, which conveniently described almost every satellite in orbit. The rise of cyber warfare added another layer. Now, a hostile actor did not need to launch a missile to cripple a satellite. A laptop, the right code, and an open vulnerability could do the same. There were whispers about satellites being turned off, about commands being hijacked, about unknown signals interfering with operations. These stories were often vague, unconfirmed, sometimes exaggerated. But they were enough to make planners nervous. Even cooperation became more cautious. Countries began to share less, to track more, to question intentions. The International Space Station, a symbol of unity, continued to operate, but even there, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Agreements were kept. Smiles were shared. But trust, in some areas, wore thin. Meanwhile, private companies entered the arena. They launched constellations of satellites for internet, imaging, and navigation. Some governments welcomed the help. Others worried about losing control. If a company had more satellites than a country, who made the rules? If one of them was attacked, who responded? The answers were murky. There were treaties, yes, the Outer Space Treaty, the Moon Agreement, various bilateral arrangements. But many of these documents were written before cell phones existed, let alone satellite swarms and commercial rockets. New technology had outpaced old policy, and everyone knew it. As space became more essential, the fear grew that a future conflict might begin with a blackout not on the ground, but in orbit, a few well-placed attacks, a cascade of collisions, a network gone dark. The scenario was dramatic, maybe even extreme, but not impossible. And in strategic planning, impossible was not the standard. Plausible was enough. So space became not just a place to reach, but a place to guard. Nations launched more satellites, monitored more skies, tested more systems. They talked about defense, but planned for offense. They spoke of peace, but studied disruption. It was not a race anymore. It was a preparation. And in the next and final part of this story, we will explore where this all leads, not just in policy and technology, but in the deeper question that underlies every launch and every treaty. Is space a battlefield waiting to happen, or can it still be a place where humanity rises above its divisions and chooses a different path? Because in the silence above, the future is watching. When the space race began, it was simple in structure, if not in execution. 2 nations, 2 ideologies, 1 sky. The competition was clear and brutal, driven by Cold War paranoia and a hunger for dominance. It was a race of firsts: first satellite, first man in orbit, first steps on the moon. Behind every achievement was a declaration: we were here first. We are stronger. We are smarter. We win. But as the decades passed, the race evolved. It fractured, expanded, matured. It became a collaboration in some places, a rivalry in others. The United States and the Soviet Union may have lit the torch, but they did not hold it forever. China, India, Europe, Japan, and dozens of smaller nations took up the flame, each with their own reasons, their own goals. What began as a sprint became a global relay, still competitive, but more complex, less binary. In that transformation, space itself changed in the world's imagination. It was no longer only the domain of heroes in silver suits and officials pointing at chalkboards filled with equations. It became commercial, crowded, strategic, but also more human, more reachable. Once a place of myth and fear, space slowly became part of daily life, from GPS and satellite television to weather models and broadband internet. We stopped looking at it as a distant unknown and began to see it as a second layer of our own world, floating just above the clouds. That shift did not happen all at once. It came through decades of launches, treaties, rivalries, and unexpected partnerships. It came through mistakes, through tragedies like the Challenger and Columbia disasters, and through quiet victories that never made the front page. And it came through the steady, persistent curiosity of people who refuse to believe that the sky should be the limit. We now live in an era that the original architects of the space race could barely imagine. Rockets land themselves. Private companies send payloads into orbit on schedules once reserved for airlines. Nations once too poor to dream of satellites now operate constellations. There are plans to return to the moon not for a few days, but to stay. Mars is on the horizon, not as fantasy, but as roadmap. Rovers roam other planets. Probes sail beyond our solar system. Telescopes capture light from galaxies born before our Earth even cooled. And yet, for all this progress, the echoes of that first race remain. The instincts that shaped it, the pride, the suspicion, the desire to be first, are still here. They still influence how we launch, how we plan, and how we talk about space. Nations still watch each other from orbit. Defense budgets still include satellites and anti-satellite systems. The treaties are still vague in the places where they most need clarity. The idea of a peaceful space, free from conflict, is noble, but it is not guaranteed. That is the paradox of space. It brings out both the best and the worst in us. On one hand, spaceflight is a triumph of collaboration, knowledge, and sheer human will. It requires countries to talk, scientists to share, cultures to align. The International Space Station, with its rotating crews of Russians, Americans, Europeans, and others, is one of the few places where diplomacy has consistently worked, even when relationships down below have frayed. It is not just a lab, it is a floating symbol of what cooperation can look like when survival depends on it. On the other hand, space also brings with it the same problems we have always faced on Earth: power struggles, inequality, competition for resources. It raises ethical questions we have barely begun to answer. Who owns the moon? Who gets to mine an asteroid? Who decides the rules in orbit, or on Mars, or beyond? There is no simple answer. There is only the reality that we carry ourselves with us wherever we go. Our technology may advance, but we remain human, brilliant, flawed, hopeful, afraid. That is why the story of the space race is not just a story of rockets and politics. It is a story of identity, of how we define progress, of how we navigate the tension between reaching higher and looking inward. Looking back, the first space race was never really about the moon. The moon was a stand-in, a distant, silent prize that let humanity project its dreams, its fears, its triumphs. The footprints we left there are not just impressions in dust. They are reminders that we are capable of immense things, that competition can lead to greatness, but only when it is tempered by purpose. That exploration is not a destination, but a mindset. The men and women who rode rockets into orbit, who walked on alien soil, who risked their lives to push the boundaries of what was possible, they were not perfect, but they were brave. They looked into the void and did not flinch. They signed up for the unknown, knowing full well that the price could be everything. And they did it not because they were told to, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. In that belief lies the truest legacy of the space race. Not the flags or the firsts, not the headlines or the trophies, but the sense that something better, something larger is possible. That humans can choose discovery over destruction. That even in a world divided by walls, ideologies, and fears, we can still find common ground, or perhaps more fittingly, common sky. The final chapters of space exploration have not been written. They may never be. There will be new races, new missions, new debates about what we should do with our expanding reach. But we have already learned something vital. That reaching for the stars does not separate us. It reveals us. And in that revelation, there is hope. We began by racing against each other. Perhaps the next journey will be one we take together. And that, more than any flag on any moon, might be the greatest leap of all. It begins with the land between rivers. Long before the rise of Rome or the pyramids of Egypt, long before the Great Wall stretched across China or the temples of the Maya pierced the jungles, there was a place where it all started. Civilization, writing, kingship, war, law, irrigation, astronomy, all of it has roots in a stretch of land cradled between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This place, known to us as Mesopotamia, was not one kingdom, but a tapestry of city-states, cultures, and shifting powers. But more than that, it was where people first turned wild soil into cities and gods into law. You have to imagine the scene. 6,000 years ago, there were no maps, no borders, no roads, just vast plains, occasional marshes, and the twin rivers that gave the land its breath. Every spring they would flood, dragging with them silt and life, soaking the flat lands in nutrients. Early people, drawn by the seasonal rhythms, learned to wait. They watched how the rivers moved. They began to dig channels and shape dikes with their hands. Where once there had been flood and famine, they created control. And from that control, they carved out the first cities humanity had ever known. It started small. A village here, a settlement there. People made homes of mud brick. They raised sheep and goats. They grew barley and wheat. They worshipped the forces they feared: storms, rivers, fire. Over time, the villages grew larger. More families came. People needed rules. They needed leaders. They needed someone to tell the gods that the people were trying. And so temples rose up in the middle of the cities. Not just simple shrines, but ziggurats, man-made mountains built brick by brick. These were the centers of life. From the temple, the gods looked down. And in the name of those gods, priests and rulers governed the people. The city of Uruk was one of the first to rise. It was unlike anything the world had seen. 50,000 people lived there, maybe more. A sea of people in mud brick homes surrounded by canals and storehouses and walls. In the center of it all stood the great temple of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. People believed she walked through the streets at night. They left offerings. They sang her name. And in her name, kings rose and ruled. One of the rulers of Uruk would become legend. His name was Gilgamesh, part man, part god, or so the story went. He would later be the hero of one of the world's oldest epics. Whether he truly lived is uncertain, but his name and his story spread like fire through the cities of Sumer. That is what the people called this southern stretch of Mesopotamia, Sumer. A land of independent cities, each with its own god, its own walls, and its own pride. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur names carved into clay that still survive. But it was not just cities and kings, it was writing. That was the real turning point. The people of Sumer created a way to speak without sound. They pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay with a reed stylus, cuneiform. At first, it was for records, grain shipments, taxes, workers. But soon, they wrote prayers, laws, stories, even dreams It was the first script. Others would follow, but this was the spark. Imagine the world before writing. Nothing was permanent. Stories had to be remembered. Numbers had to be counted by hand. Laws had to be told and retold. But with writing, they could record everything. They could send messages. They could write contracts. They could leave something for those who came after. They could, in a way, become immortal. Of course, there was darkness too. With civilization came conflict. The city-states did not live in peace. They fought over water, over trade, over land. Armies marched. Sumerian kings recorded their victories on stone steles and temple walls. They named themselves servants of the gods, but their hands were red with war. As the cities grew in wealth and power, so too did their rivalries. In time, a man named Sargon would rise in the north and forge the first empire the world had ever seen, but that is a tale for another time. The people of Sumer left more than stone and brick. They left myths, stories of gods who quarreled like men, of a great flood sent to punish the world, of the creation of humans from clay. These stories, buried for millennia, would echo into other cultures. Later, the Hebrews would tell of a man named Noah. The Greeks would speak of Pandora and Prometheus. But their roots, in many ways, begin here, in the cracked earth of Sumer. The land itself is almost unrecognizable now. The rivers have shifted. The cities lie in ruins beneath the soil of southern Iraq. But archaeologists have uncovered their bones. They have found the temples, the tablets, the tools of life and death. They have walked through the gates of Ur and stood beneath the crumbled bricks of ziggurats that once touched the sky. And even now, thousands of years later, it feels strangely familiar. The need to write, the urge to build, the desire to make something last. It all started here, in the land between rivers. This was the first breath of civilization, and it was only the beginning. It is easy to forget that the cities of ancient Mesopotamia were not simply ruins and myths, but living, breathing places filled with ordinary people. Long before kings carved their victories in stone and priests read omens in the stars, life unfolded in the narrow streets between mud-brick homes. The hum of voices, the clatter of pottery, the scent of baked barley and warm clay, these were the daily rhythms of a world quietly inventing the future. A typical home in a city like Ur or Lagash was not grand. It was built with sun-dried bricks, often with 2 or 3 small rooms, sometimes even a second floor if the family was fortunate. The roof was flat and used for sleeping in the cooler night air. There was no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters. Floors were swept smooth and covered in woven reed mats. The people who lived in these homes rose with the sun and moved with the pace of the seasons. Their lives were measured not by hours, but by harvests and floods. Fathers worked in fields outside the city walls or in the workshops near the temple. Farmers plowed with wooden tools drawn by oxen, turning the dark soil made fertile by the river. They grew barley, wheat, flax, onions, lentils. Irrigation canals carried water from the Tigris and Euphrates across wide fields, and the management of those canals was critical. A blocked channel or a broken dam could ruin a year's crop. So even in the earliest days, the work of farmers was tied to the decisions of city officials and overseers who watched the flow of water like priests watched the skies. Inside the cities, craftsmen shaped the goods of daily life. There were potters who spun clay into bowls and jars, their hands moving with a rhythm passed down for generations. Metalworkers hammered copper and bronze into blades and tools. Weavers made cloth from wool and flax, their looms clacking in courtyards open to the air. And there were builders, skilled in the art of brick and bitumen, who laid the foundations of temples and homes with an eye for balance and strength. Markets were where the city truly came alive. There was no coinage, not yet. Trade was built on barter, trust, and careful records. A farmer brought bundles of grain. A fisherman offered dried carp from the river. Traders from far beyond the city walls arrived with donkeys laden with goods, obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from distant mountains, cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon. Deals were made with handshakes, nods, and occasionally clay tokens pressed into tablets to mark the transaction. Scribes sat in shaded corners of the market, recording trades and promises, contracts and debts, the hum of life captured in cuneiform. Children learned early. Boys might be sent to temple schools if their families were wealthy or connected. There they learned the complicated art of writing, memorizing dozens of symbols and their meanings. It was not easy. A child could spend years learning how to press the stylus just right, to create the marks that spoke not only of numbers and trade, but of kings and gods. Girls, more often, learned from their mothers how to cook, weave, manage a household, and care for the younger children. Still, there are records of women who ran businesses, owned property, and even served as priestesses. Mesopotamia was a patriarchal world, but not without its exceptions. The heart of each city was the temple. It rose like a mountain above the rooftops, built in layers of brick with a staircase that stretched toward the sky. The ziggurat was not a place for public worship, but the dwelling place of the god or goddess who ruled the city. Each city had its patron deity, Inanna in Uruk, Enlil in Nippur, Nana in Ur. People believed the god lived there, really lived there, and had to be cared for like a royal guest. Priests brought food offerings, cleaned the statue, dressed it in fine cloth. Ceremonies were held during festivals. Music was played. Incense filled the air. Religion was not separate from life. It was life. Every harvest, every storm, every illness, every victory in war was the will of the gods. To question that was not only dangerous, it was unthinkable. If the crops failed, it was because the gods were angry. If a child was born with a defect, it was a message. So people made offerings, they prayed, they sought signs in the stars and dreams. And when the unknown came, they turned to the priests and seers who claimed to understand the divine. Despite the richness of their culture, the Sumerians and their neighbors lived with constant uncertainty. Floods could wipe out whole villages. Drought could turn canals into cracked mud. Armies from other cities or from the rising powers in the north could march in and tear down what had taken generations to build. So the people adapted. They rebuilt. And in rebuilding, they refined their cities, their laws, their systems. Bit by bit, the civilization grew more complex. One of the greatest changes came not from kings or priests, but from clay and ink. The scribes, those quiet men who sat in the shade with tablets and styluses, were shaping the memory of the world. They were not just recording trade deals. They were writing hymns, poems, legal rulings, letters between rulers, school exercises, jokes, even instructions for brewing beer. Through their hands, the voice of Mesopotamia was recorded line by line, word by word. Thousands of those tablets still survive, buried under centuries of dust. Some are cracked, some are incomplete, but many still speak. You can read them. You can hear their voices. a man worrying about his lost ox, a woman pleading for her inheritance, a teacher correcting a student, a king declaring his right to rule. They are not distant, not strange. They are us, only older. So when you picture Mesopotamia, do not see only the ruins and the empires. See the little girl learning to grind flour. See the old man watching the sky from his roof. See the priest whispering a prayer as he places a bowl of dates before a stone goddess. This was a world not of legends, but of people. Real people in a real place, living real lives. And yet, something was shifting. Power was rising in the north, and with it, a man who would change everything. But that is for the next part of the story. North of the ancient cities of Sumer, beyond the flat floodplains and the glinting canals, another world was taking shape. It was not as old as Uruk or Eridu, but it was growing fast. This was the land of Akkad. Less is known about it than Sumer, but what we do know comes from the stories told about a man who would reshape Mesopotamia forever. His name was Sargon. He was not born in a palace. He was not the son of a king. According to later legends, he was the child of a humble woman, perhaps even left floating in a basket on a river, rescued and raised by a gardener. It is hard to know where the myth ends and the truth begins, but this much is clear: Sargon rose from obscurity to carve out the world's first empire. At the time, Sumer was still a patchwork of city-states, each proud and independent, each ruled by its own king and guided by its own god. They fought one another often, but none had managed to dominate the whole. That was about to change. Sargon first served as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a respected city to the north. A cupbearer was not a servant in the way we think of one now. He was close to power, trusted, present at the highest councils. And at some point, Sargon saw his chance. He seized control of Kish and began to march south. One by one, the cities of Sumer fell to him. Some surrendered, others fought. Either way, Sargon was relentless. He did not just take cities, he absorbed them. He stationed governors. He established supply lines. He built a standing army that moved as one, loyal not to a city or a temple, but to him. His reach spread beyond Sumer, into Elam in the east, and far toward the west. For the first time in recorded history, a single ruler controlled all of Lower Mesopotamia, and he would not stop there. This was not conquest for the sake of glory alone. Sargon had a vision. He wanted unity. He wanted permanence, and so he founded a new city, Akkad. Its location has never been found, lost to time and shifting earth, but it was the heart of his empire. From Akkad, Sargon ruled for more than 50 years. He was not just a warlord. He was an organizer, a strategist, a builder. Under his rule, the Akkadian language spread, replacing Sumerian in administration and inscriptions. It did not erase the old culture, but it built on it, blended it, made it something new. The empire of Akkad was unlike anything that had come before. Trade routes stretched across mountains and deserts. Goods flowed in from the Persian Gulf, the Levant, and beyond. The wealth of the empire was staggering, and Sargon made sure his image was known throughout it. His likeness, carved into stone, was set in temples and gates. His name appeared on tablets from distant towns. He was not just a king, he was the king, chosen by the gods to rule the world. But empires are not held together by swords alone. They require administration, supply, diplomacy, and fear. Sargon was skilled in all of them, but even he faced resistance. The South never fully accepted Akkadian rule. Revolts flared up again and again. Temples resented the new governors. Scribes and priests, who had lived under centuries of local kings, did not give up their power easily. Still, Sargon crushed the uprisings and held the empire together until his death. After him came his grandson, Naram-Sin. And with Naram-Sin, the empire reached its peak and its breaking point. Naram-Sin was bold, ambitious, and ruthless. He declared himself a god, a living deity, the king of the four quarters of the world. That title alone tells you everything. No longer just the land between rivers, no longer just Mesopotamia. He believed he ruled the entire known world. His image, shown with a horned helmet normally worn by gods, still survives carved in stone. It shows him climbing over the bodies of his enemies, victorious, divine, unstoppable. But even gods fall. Naram-Sin's reign was marked by growing unrest. Climate patterns began to shift. Drought gripped the land. Crops failed. Famine spread. The same rivers that had once brought life now brought nothing. At the same time, pressure from outside the empire increased. Mountain tribes to the east, long considered little more than raiders, began to press in with greater force and coordination. They were known as the Gutians, and they would play a part in what came next. The fall of Akkad did not come in a single battle. It was slow. Cities began to break away. Provinces stopped paying tribute. The central government weakened. Records grew thinner. As always, myths grew to fill the silence. One later tablet described how Naram-Sin angered the gods, who then cursed his empire. It tells of omens and dreams, of temples abandoned, of statues weeping. Whether or not those stories are true, they reflect something real. The people of Mesopotamia felt that something sacred had been broken. In the end, Akkad vanished as quickly as it rose. The city itself, the one founded by Sargon, has never been found. It may lie buried under farmland or hidden beneath another settlement. What remains is the memory of a people who dreamed of unity, who tried to bind dozens of cities and cultures together under one banner. And for a time, they succeeded. Yet even as the empire fell, its influence lingered. Akkadian language and culture had taken root. The idea of empire, of central rule, of gods who gave power to kings, these ideas would shape Mesopotamia for centuries. Later rulers would claim descent from Sargon. They would write his name into their titles, hoping to borrow the weight of his legend. He was, in many ways, the template, the first of his kind. The collapse of Akkad did not mean the end of civilization in Mesopotamia. Far from it. The cities of Sumer endured. New powers would rise from the ashes, and old gods would take new forms. The wheel kept turning, but something had changed. The world had seen what an empire could be. The memory of Sargon and Akkad would remain like a shadow over all who came after. In the quiet that followed, the people looked once again to the old cities, to Ur, to Lagash, to Nippur. Power would shift south again. The cities would rise once more, stronger, wiser, and determined to rebuild. What came next would be one of the most refined and deeply structured societies Mesopotamia had ever seen. But that story begins in the city of Ur, and it will be told in the next part. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed, Mesopotamia did not fall into silence. The lands between the rivers were too rich, too vital, too full of memory to stay broken for long. As the dust settled, old cities found their strength again. The south, where Sumer had first risen, became the heart of something new. Among the returning powers, one city stood out: Ur. Ur had always been important. It had been a sacred place, a city of trade and worship, a city watched over by the moon god Nana. But now, in the wake of imperial collapse, Ur would become more than just a city. It would rise as the capital of what many historians now call the Sumerian Renaissance. For a time, it would be the most powerful city in the known world. The kings of Ur did not try to erase the past. They did not tear down what Akkad had built. Instead, they embraced the traditions of Sumer and layered them with lessons learned from empire. Their reigns were recorded in detail, and their ambitions were vast. They built towering ziggurats, reformed laws, organized trade routes, and governed with a vision of order and prosperity. The dynasty they created is known today as the Third Dynasty of Ur, often written as Ur III. The most famous of these rulers was Shulgi. He was the son of Ur-Nammu, the king who founded the dynasty. But it was under Shulgi that the city reached its peak. He ruled for nearly half a century. That kind of reign was rare, even dangerous. A long rule could bring either stability or slow decay. In Shulgi's case, it brought a flowering of administration, culture, and control. He did not just call himself king, he claimed divinity. Like Naram-Sin before him, he declared himself a god, and his court began treating him as one. But Shulgi was more than just grand titles. He was a builder. He expanded the great ziggurat of Ur, that stepped pyramid of mud brick that still stands in broken majesty today. He built roads between cities, stationed guards along the routes, and created a system of way stations for travelers. He unified weights and measures. He standardized the calendar. Under his rule, scribes compiled and copied texts, creating schools and libraries that helped preserve Sumerian knowledge for centuries. He was also a man of ambition and ego. In hymns written during his reign, Shulgi praises himself with almost comic self-love. He claimed to be the fastest runner, the wisest judge, the most skilled warrior, the best singer. Whether those claims were true or not did not matter. What mattered was that he shaped the image of kingship in his time. He presented himself as both divine and capable, a bringer of order in a world that always seemed on the edge of chaos. And yet, even in this golden age, shadows were forming. The strength of Ur III came from its central authority. That was its glory, and in time it would be its weakness. The government was massive and detailed. There were governors, inspectors, tax collectors, scribes, generals, and priests, all reporting back to the capital. The system worked, but it was heavy. To feed the center, the countryside had to be taxed, organized, and kept in line. Dissent could not be tolerated. Rebellion could not be allowed. And so the state grew rigid, cautious, at times brutal. The borders were always under threat. To the east, the Elamites watched and waited. To the north, tribes moved across the hills. Shulgi and his successors built walls and forts. They sent out campaigns. But they could not be everywhere. The empire needed loyal governors, stable weather, a steady flow of grain, and peace among the cities. That was asking a lot from a land as unpredictable as Mesopotamia. When Shulgi died, his sons continued his work. They maintained the temples, the canals, the archives. But they also faced growing unrest. The outer cities began to resist the central control. The flow of tribute slowed. The priesthood, once an ally, grew wary of royal power. Famine struck in some areas. Floods damaged others. The system began to creak under its own weight. And then came the Elamites. They had watched from their highlands in the east, seen the wealth of Ur, and bided their time. Around 200 years after the fall of Akkad, they struck. Their armies moved fast, breaking through defenses, sacking cities, and reaching deep into Sumer. Ur, the great city of the moon god, the pride of the southern plain, was taken. The temples were looted, the palace was burned, the statues of kings were toppled. The city that had once claimed to rule the world was left in ruins. There are texts that survive from the time of Ur's fall. They are haunting. One lament, known as the Lamentation for Ur, reads like a dirge. It speaks of the city's destruction as if the gods themselves had turned their backs. The river no longer flowed. The fields gave no grain. The people cried out, and no one answered. The ziggurat stood empty, the god gone. It was not just the end of a city, it was the end of an era. And yet, even after the fall, the legacy of Ur endured. Its scribes had preserved Sumerian culture in a way that no previous city had. Its law codes, its literature, its religious practices, all were passed down to the cities that would rise next. Babylon, for example, would absorb much from Ur and build something even greater from the ashes. The story of Ur is a reminder. In Mesopotamia, nothing stayed the same for long. Rivers changed course. Kings rose and fell. Cities burned and were rebuilt. But the threads of memory, the stories and systems and beliefs, were never truly lost. They were carried forward, written in clay, echoed in prayers, and rebuilt in new forms. As Ur fell, the stage was being set for a new city to rise, one that would take the dreams of Sumer, the ambition of Akkad, and the order of Ur, and turn them into something that would shape history for centuries. That city was Babylon, and its story begins next. In the quiet after the fall of Ur, the land between the rivers entered yet another period of uncertainty. The mighty ziggurat of Ur still stood, but its altars were cold and its halls were hollow. Sumerian culture lived on, but the old gods seemed silent. The Elamites had torn through the south and left behind broken cities and scattered records. For a time, Mesopotamia became a patchwork again, a region of shifting borders, restless towns, and scattered tribes. But in this fractured world, one city was beginning to stir. Its name was Babylon. At first, Babylon was nothing special. It was a modest settlement in central Mesopotamia, near the wide bend of the Euphrates River. It had no legendary past like Uruk, no sacred name like Nippur, no imperial history like Akkad. It was just a city, one of many, surviving in a region still scarred by war. But Babylon had something the others lacked. It had location. It sat at the crossroads of trade and travel, between the rich farmlands of the south and the ambitious cities of the north. And soon it had a man with vision. That man was Hammurabi. Hammurabi did not begin as a conqueror. When he became king around the early 18th century before the Common Era, Babylon was still small. Its walls were sturdy but not grand. Its influence did not reach far. But Hammurabi understood something most kings did not. He saw that power did not only come from the sword, it came from systems, from law, from trust. And so he began his rule not with war, but with building. He strengthened the walls of Babylon. He restored temples. He dug canals. He improved irrigation so that the surrounding fields could produce more grain. He called together scribes and advisors and began writing policies that would later become some of the most famous laws in history. Slowly, the city grew in wealth and reputation. Its markets swelled with goods. Its name spread beyond the riverbanks. But Hammurabi was no pacifist. Once his base was strong, he began to look outward. At first, he moved carefully. He made alliances with neighboring kings. He signed treaties. He offered help. And then, when the time was right, he struck. Over the course of several decades, Hammurabi expanded his control through both diplomacy and force. He defeated rivals one by one, always justifying his actions as necessary for order and justice. By the end of his reign, he had done what few before him had managed. He united nearly all of southern Mesopotamia under his rule. Babylon was no longer a minor city. It was the beating heart of a kingdom that stretched across rivers and deserts, temples and trade routes. And unlike many kings, Hammurabi left behind more than ruins and legends. He left his words. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the oldest and most complete legal codes ever discovered. Carved into a tall stone stele and placed in public for all to see, it laid out the laws of the land in clear, forceful terms. There were laws for trade, marriage, theft, assault, debt, slavery, and inheritance. There were punishments, often harsh, meant to match the crime. And above all, there was a message that justice was not the whim of kings, but the foundation of society. At the top of the stone, Hammurabi is shown receiving the law from Shamash, the god of justice and the sun. This image was powerful. It told the people that the laws were divine, not just royal. That the king was not just a ruler, but a servant of higher order. In a time when power often meant little more than force, this was revolutionary. But Babylon was more than law and order. It became a cultural and religious center. The god Marduk, once a local deity, rose to prominence. Under Hammurabi and his successors, Marduk was declared king of the gods. His temple, called Esagila, became one of the most important in the region. Festivals were held in his honor, involving music, processions, offerings, and rituals meant to ensure the balance of the universe. Babylon was no longer just a city. It was a symbol of cosmic harmony. Life in Babylon during this period was bustling. The streets were lined with workshops and homes. Merchants sold dates, fish, grain, and textiles. Children attended scribal schools, learning to read and write cuneiform. Judges presided over court disputes, reading from clay tablets. Priests oversaw ceremonies and made astronomical observations. Artisans carved images of gods and kings. Farmers brought their grain to the city storehouses. Everything was recorded, counted, and organized. Clay tablets from this era give us a surprisingly detailed view of daily life. We know about the prices of donkeys, the weight of silver in a fine robe, the punishment for breaking an irrigation canal, and even the details of a marriage contract. The records show a society that valued order and memory, where almost nothing was left unwritten. These tablets were baked or left to dry and then stored in archives. Thousands of them survive today, silent witnesses to a world long gone. Despite its strength, Babylon's golden age under Hammurabi did not last forever. After his death, his empire began to weaken. His successors struggled to hold together the vast territory he had built. Revolts broke out, rivals grew bold again, and eventually the empire fractured. Babylon remained important, but the unity Hammurabi had forged could not be sustained. Still, the legacy of Babylon was secure. The very name of the city would echo through time. It would rise again in future centuries, greater and grander than before. But even in this early moment, Babylon had already shaped the world. It had shown that cities could be more than fortresses, that kings could be more than warriors, that laws could bind people together across distance and difference. The spirit of Hammurabi's Babylon lived on not just in stones and tablets, but in the idea that civilization meant more than survival. It meant structure, it meant vision, and it meant the hope that order could rise from chaos. But while Babylon stood strong in the center of the land, other cultures were rising at its edges. One in particular, older than Babylon itself, had begun to fade from view, even as its ideas continued to echo in temples, in trade routes, and in the very shape of writing itself. In the final part of this series, we will turn to the forgotten ones. The people whose names were buried but whose fingerprints remain: the Hittites, the Hurrians, the Ablates, and the others who walked alongside the giants of Mesopotamia before the world was ready to remember them. Long before the pyramids cast shadows on the Nile, and long before the marble columns of Athens rose toward the sky, the people of Mesopotamia were already building their world. They had mapped the stars, carved the laws, raised the ziggurats, and whispered to the gods. Their voices, shaped in clay, still echo today. But this story is not only about the great cities Uruk, Ur, Akkad, Babylon. It is also about those who walked beside them, whose names faded sooner, but whose stories still matter. Beyond the wide rivers and fertile fields, there were other lands and other people. To the north and west lived the Hurrians, mountain folk with a language of their own, whose culture would later shape the kingdoms of Anatolia and Syria. They were traders, warriors, musicians. Their myths blended with those of Mesopotamia, and their names appear on clay tablets from temples and palaces. Though their cities were never as grand, they contributed to the great conversation of civilization. Then there were the Hittites. They would rise later, farther north, in the highlands of what is now Turkey. At first, they were seen as outsiders, strange, distant, less refined. But over time, they learned from the older cultures of Mesopotamia. They borrowed scripts, copied legal codes, adapted rituals. And in doing so, they preserved and passed forward pieces of Sumerian and Akkadian knowledge that might have otherwise been lost. To the east were the Elamites, fierce, often in conflict with the cities of Sumer and Akkad. They were both enemies and mirrors. Their capital, Susa, was a rival to Ur and Babylon. They raided and conquered, but they also traded, wrote, built temples, and ruled for centuries. Their language was unique, their traditions complex. And though they were often cast as invaders in Sumerian records, the truth is more complicated. They were part of the same world, different voices in the same song. Further west still, there were the Amorites, nomads from the deserts and hills who entered Mesopotamia over generations. At first, they were seen as a threat, rough, uncultured, foreign. But in time, they became kings. Hammurabi himself was of Amorite origin, and through rulers like him, the Amorites helped shape the very heart of Mesopotamian civilization. They did not destroy the cities they entered. They adopted them, ruled from them, and gave them new life. This pattern was the rhythm of Mesopotamian history. Old powers fell, and new ones rose in their place. Cultures clashed, blended, borrowed. Gods were renamed, rewritten, merged. The Sumerians created the blueprint. The Akkadians expanded it. The Babylonians refined it. And countless others left their fingerprints on its walls, its words, and its memory. Even as cities were sacked and empires fell, the core of what Mesopotamia had built remained. Writing survived. Law survived. The idea that people could live together under rules, protected by order, guided by ritual and tradition that survived. The clay tablets outlasted the kings. The stories endured longer than the stone. Eventually, the center of power would shift again. Assyria would rise in the north, building cities of towering stone walls and palaces filled with carvings of war and conquest. Babylon would rise once more, reaching a height under Nebuchadnezzar that would be remembered for centuries, its hanging garden spoken of as a wonder of the world. And later, the Persians would come. Then the Greeks, then the Romans, each bringing something new, each leaving something behind. But all of them, in some way, carried a piece of Mesopotamia forward. By the time the last cuneiform tablet was written, the world had already changed. The old gods were quiet. The ziggurat stood empty. The reed stylus was replaced by pen and ink. And yet, the spirit of Mesopotamia the deep, human need to understand the world, to name it, to record it, to build something that would last never disappeared. Today, the ruins of those cities lie buried under centuries of dust. The rivers have changed course. The temples are broken. The palaces are rubble. But archaeologists have walked those ancient streets. They have uncovered the tablets, deciphered the signs, and breathed life back into the voices of a world that once was. We know how Sumerians baked bread, how Akkadians marched into battle, how Babylonian priests read the stars. We know the words of kings, the fears of merchants, the dreams of scribes. We know how people lived, how they loved, how they died. And in knowing that, we are reminded of something simple and profound. They were people, just like us. They argued and believed. They worked and rested. They sang and mourned. They asked questions. They feared the unknown. And they tried in their own way to leave a mark. Not to dominate the world, but to make sense of it, to shape it, to remember it, and in doing so, they shaped all of us. Civilization did not begin with a single spark. It began with many small fires lit by hands that shaped mud into homes, grain into bread, and silence into story. Mesopotamia was not the only cradle of civilization, but it was one of the first to speak, to write, to reach. And though its empires have fallen, its influence has never truly faded. When we speak of law, we echo Hammurabi. When we write, we owe a debt to the scribes of Uruk. When we plan cities, balance accounts, divide land, or tell stories about gods and heroes and the nature of fate, we are, in some way, continuing a tradition that began thousands of years ago between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So this is where the story ends. In a land where the rivers once flooded with life, where clay was pressed with the first words, where temples rose like mountains and the night sky was red like scripture. A land built not just by kings and warriors, but by farmers, priests, builders, mothers, children, and strangers whose names we will never know. It ends not with a fall, but with a legacy, not with silence, but with memory. And that memory, carried forward by time, remains alive in the words we use, the cities we build, and the questions we still ask. This was Mesopotamia, and it mattered.